wartime zone. At exactly 4 a.m. on a moonless night in late 2025, two Ukrainian F-16 Vipers cruised on station 100 miles out over the Black Sea, their pilots staring at strobing red threat warnings on cockpit displays as Russian S-400 radars from Crimea painted them relentlessly. With margin for error 0 and time remaining just 14 seconds to release, Viper 1's pilot had one narrow window to fire an AGM-88 HARM missile straight into the heart of a Panzer radar guarding a secret Russian convoy. Miss, and 20 Ukrainian drones skimming treetops inbound would be neutralized instantly. This mission was critical. Russia desperately hid losing 60% of its Iskander force the previous week in devastating Ukrainian strikes. Moscow spent millions sneaking remaining 6 battered Iskander-M launchers and 8 transloaders into Crimea under darkness for repairs at Sevastopol shipyards. If the convoy reached safety, Putin regained his long-range hammer by spring 2026. If not, Russia's southern front lost its big punch for the entire year. What unfolded over the next 40 minutes became one of the war's most sophisticated combined operations. Layered deception with F-16 decoys, anti-radiation missiles, and autonomous drone swarms turning Russian defenses against themselves in a masterclass of asymmetric precision. The operation's roots trace to Ukrainian intelligence breakthroughs in autumn 2025, when reconnaissance, PD-2 drones, satellite imagery, signals intercepts revealed Russia's frantic efforts to salvage Iskander brigades after catastrophic losses. Previous strikes destroyed dozens of launchers across southern sectors, degrading Russia's ability to deliver precision ballistic fire that terrorized Ukrainian cities and logistics. Remaining systems, mobile, deadly but maintenance-heavy, required secure Crimean facilities for overhaul. Convoy on A290 highway became high-priority target. 6 Iskander-M launchers, 8 transloaders, support vehicles racing under cover of night, escorted by Panzer IS-1, shielded by Krasuka 4EW flooding bands with noise, overlooked by S-400 batteries from Crimea. Russian commanders believed convoy invisible. Lights off, EW blanketing GPS and radio, radars filtering clutter. But thermal truth betrayed them. In freezing darkness, massive diesel engines and hydraulics radiated heat for hours, even powered down. High above at 9,800 feet, lone Ukrainian PD-2 drones circled silently, thermal camera zooming on highway spotting 18 large signatures moving steadily. PD-2 beamed live coordinates to headquarters. No attack, just eyes enabling digital trap. At 4 a.m. F-16 Vipers reached release point over Black Sea, far from Crimean defenses but within harm range. Mission wasn't dogfight but clinical execution. Viper 1 released 4 ADM-160 MLD decoys, $120,000 digital gaslighters mimicking full F-16 radar cross-sections and flight profiles. As turbojets ignited, MALD's broadcast signatures convincing radars of massive inbound strike package at Mach 0.9 toward Kerch Bridge. Inside Russian S-400 command van near Sevastopol, screens clear moments earlier strobed with 12 high-speed contacts. Panic erupted. Operator screamed, multiple vampires, 12 F-16s inbound. Commander faced dilemma. Wait verification risking bridge destruction or engage exposing position. He chose fire. Batteries erupted, multi-million-dollar interceptors chasing phantoms and ultimate bad ROI. Expensive missiles wasted on cheap decoys. Real cost was emission. Activating high-power engagement radars lit flare in dark room. Viper 1's display achieved handshake. AGM-88 HARM locked on radiation. Magnum AGM-88 away. Supersonic anti-radiation missile followed beam home like moth to flame. On A290, Panzer escort activated fire control radar protecting convoy, fatal error. HARM at Mach 2 covered distance seconds. Operator saw high-speed blip too late. 30-ton vehicle couldn't dodge. Warhead with tungsten cubes detonated above radar array, shredding brain of defense. Krasuka 4EW screamed into empty sky. Umbrella ripped open. Convoy naked. GPS jammers offline, radar smoking wreck, soldiers staring darkness realizing ghosts were distraction. Path cleared for thermal hunters 60 seconds away. Skimming 50 feet above frozen treeline, real package, 10 Ludi long-range stealth drones, 10 thermal hunter FPVs in tight formation, nap of Earth extreme. Hiding behind terrain beneath remaining sensors. New variable. Russian Mi-28 night hunter helicopter patrolling swept thermal searchlight across treeline. Nose optic caught lead Ludi engine flicker. Pilot locked Igla missile, squeezed trigger. Mach 2 missile streaked. Ukrainian operator outsmarted physics. Dove desperately under concrete viaduct on A290, masking heat against massive thermal mass and clutter. Igla, blinded by lost contrast, whizzed past, exploding harmlessly. Near-miss shook feed but saved drone and mission. Mi-28 circled wrong sky, chasing shadows. Panzer crews reloaded, wondering chaos, path wide open. Thermal hunters closed, cameras locked, glowing signatures Russia couldn't hide. Krasuka 4 flooded bands, but drones transitioned autonomous, AI processors taking over as radio severed. Terminal lock, world high-contrast heat map, 40-ton Iskanders glowing like stars in freezing air, radiating hours post-shutdown. Lead FPV identified, fuel Bowser next transloaders, 120 miles per hour kamikaze plunge. Shaped charge punched tank, molten copper jet ignited catastrophe, orange fireball 150 feet, secondaries from boosters rhythmic thuds. Billion-dollar jammers intact but useless, watching crown jewels disintegrate. At 4:15 a.m., survivors raced bridge approach. Russian Tor M2 swung position. Radar searched but F-16 EW pump jamming, screens mess interference. Second swarm terminal dive, targeted bottleneck hangar packed spares. Impact blinding flash, high-pressure fluid/propellant cook-off, shockwave buckled asphalt, cracked columns. Bridge intact but approach compromised, logistical thrombus blocking Crimea's backbone days. In 40 minutes, the southern front changed its rhythm, not with a thunderous breakthrough or a massed armored charge, but with something far more unsettling for the side on the receiving end. Silence, confusion, and sudden absence. A Russian logistics convoy that had taken weeks to assemble, protect, and route simply ceased to function. Vehicles burned where they stopped. Survivors scattered without orders. Radios crackled with overlapping reports that made no sense when stitched together. And behind it all was a realization that would take far longer than 40 minutes to fully absorb. The old assumptions about protection, depth, and escalation no longer applied. The convoy itself was not small. It was a layered movement of fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, maintenance vehicles, and mobile air defense escorts, moving along what Russian planners believed was a relatively secure artery feeding the southern grouping. The supply line mattered. It supported artillery batteries, air defense nodes, and forward mechanized units that had already been stretched thin by months of attritional fighting. Every kilometer of that road represented effort. Engineers clearing routes, units rotating protection, commanders betting that the enemy either could not see clearly enough or could not strike decisively enough to make the risk unacceptable. That bet failed. The operation began quietly, almost invisibly. Ukrainian planners did not open with missiles or aircraft. They opened with absence, with nothing happening where Russia expected something to happen. Electronic silence, broken only by faint, ambiguous signatures that Russian sensors struggled to classify. These were decoys at first, cheap, expendable drones designed not to kill but to provoke. They drifted into radar coverage, flickered on and off, mimicking the profiles of more dangerous systems just convincingly enough to trigger responses. And responses came. Russian air defense escorts, trained to assume that any unidentified aerial contact might be the prelude to a strike, powered up radars. Tracking beams swept the sky. Fire control systems came online. In that moment, they did exactly what Ukrainian doctrine had been waiting for them to do. They revealed themselves. Once those radars emitted, the second layer unfolded. High-speed anti-radiation missiles, HARMs, were already airborne, cued not by human controllers staring at screens, but by a network that fused passive detection, preloaded threat libraries, and real-time signal triangulation. The escorts barely had time to register the danger before the first impacts hit. Some systems shut down in panic, others attempted to relocate, but the window had already closed. Emission had been enough. Blindness followed. With escorts degraded or destroyed, the convoy's protective bubble collapsed. What remained were trucks and crews suddenly exposed in open terrain, without reliable situational awareness. Drivers slowed. Formations bunched. Confusion rippled backward and forward along the column as orders conflicted and assumptions crumbled. That was when the hunters arrived. 20 drones, launched in waves, did not descend all at once. They arrived from different bearings, altitudes, and timings, each autonomous enough to continue its mission even as communications were jammed or disrupted. These were not simple loitering munitions blindly searching for targets. They carried thermal sensors and pattern recognition software trained on the signatures of fuel trucks, ammunition loads, and command vehicles. Heat betrayed what camouflage tried to hide. Engines idling too long glowed. Brake systems overheated under sudden stops. Human clustering around stalled vehicles created unmistakable thermal blooms. One by one, the drones committed. Explosions walked down the convoy not as a single catastrophic chain reaction, but as a methodical dismantling. A fuel truck ignited, forcing adjacent vehicles to halt. An ammunition carrier detonated, scattering shrapnel across the road and into nearby ditches. Command vehicles were hit next, not by chance but by design, decapitation before annihilation. Without coordination, without eyes in the sky, the remaining drivers did the only thing they could. They abandoned vehicles and ran. Above this chaos, 2 Ukrainian F-16 sorties passed through the battle space. They did not linger. They did not engage in dogfights or dramatic low-altitude attacks. Their role was sharper and more contained: suppression and deterrence. By appearing on Russian sensors at precisely the wrong moment, they forced Russian commanders to assume escalation. Air defense units farther back activated, aircraft were scrambled, and, critically, strategic air defense assets were brought to readiness. Among them were Kinzhals. The Kinzhal missile occupies a particular psychological and doctrinal space in Russian thinking. Expensive, limited in number, and often portrayed as near invulnerable, it is not meant to be expended lightly. Yet in this engagement, the pressure to demonstrate control, to signal that escalation would be met, overrode caution. Kinzhals were burned not against decisive targets, but as reassurance, as spectacle, as an attempt to reassert dominance in a battle space that had just slipped out of grasp. Each launch carried a cost far beyond its price tag. Kinzhals used here were Kinzhals not available elsewhere. They replaced Iskanders that could no longer be relied upon in the same way, stretching logistics already under strain. And all of this was triggered not by a massive Ukrainian offensive, but by a deception-driven strike that forced Russia to escalate against shadows. By the time the smoke settled, the convoy was gone as a functional entity. The road it had traveled became a dead zone, littered with wreckage and unexploded ordnance. Engineers would need days to clear it. Replacement supplies would need weeks to assemble. Units at the front began rationing almost immediately, fuel first, then ammunition, then movement itself. The southern front did not collapse. That was never the point. Instead, it slowed, stiffened, and lost initiative. Planned rotations were delayed. Artillery fires thinned. Commanders grew cautious, aware now that movement itself carried new and poorly understood risks. In warfare, hesitation is contagious. By 2026, this pattern had repeated often enough to become a defining feature of the conflict. Not overwhelming force but layered deception. Not brute strength but precision multiplied through systems thinking. Ukrainian operations increasingly followed this logic. Force the enemy to see what you want them to see, compel them to react in predictable ways, then strike where their reactions create vulnerability. Decoy ghosts mattered because they forced emissions. Emissions mattered because they could be hunted. And once hunted, the escorts that once protected supply lines became liabilities, beacons rather than shields. Autonomous hunters mattered because they exploited thermal truth. Heat does not lie. It reveals engines, humans, stress, and fear in ways camouflage and doctrine cannot erase. In a battle space saturated with sensors, the side that best understands which signatures matter gains an advantage that compounds over time. And precision mattered most of all. Ukrainian strikes increasingly resembled clinical procedures rather than battles. Minimal force was applied, but at exactly the right points. The objective was not spectacle or attrition, but paralysis, turning a functioning system into a stalled one with as little expenditure as possible. Every destroyed truck mattered less than the timing of its destruction. Every delayed resupply mattered more than the crater left behind. This was asymmetric mastery in practice, not as a slogan or a theory, but as something lived and executed under pressure. Not because Ukraine possessed more resources, it did not, but because it learned faster how to turn information into effect, perception into leverage, and time into a weapon. Where Russia continued to rely on mass and assumption, Ukraine built its approach around correlation and consequence. Where one side escalated to reassure itself and its hierarchy, the other escalated only after the outcome had already been shaped, narrowed, and quietly decided. The distinction mattered because mass without clarity is inertia. It looks powerful, it feels decisive, but it moves slowly and reacts poorly to surprise. Russian planning still assumed that protection came from density, more vehicles, more escorts, more overlapping systems. If a convoy was valuable, it was reinforced. If a route mattered, it was guarded. If an area felt threatened, emissions increased, radars lit up, and readiness levels climbed. Each of these actions made sense within a traditional framework. Each also created data. Ukraine treated that data as terrain. Every radar pulse, every encrypted transmission spike, every shift in air defense posture was logged, correlated, and compared against patterns observed weeks earlier. Nothing was viewed in isolation. A radar activation was not just a defensive measure, it was a timestamp. A change in convoy spacing was not just a logistical adjustment, it was an indicator of stress. Over time, these fragments assembled into models that predicted behavior with increasing accuracy. This is where the asymmetry deepened. Ukraine did not need to destroy every convoy to shape the battlefield. It needed to demonstrate, selectively and convincingly, that no convoy could ever be assumed safe. Once that belief took hold, behavior changed on its own. Routes were altered, schedules delayed, escorts thickened. Each adaptation consumed resources, time, and mental bandwidth. Each also created new vulnerabilities. The 40-minute strike was not exceptional because of its violence. It was exceptional because of its restraint. No excess munitions were wasted. No unnecessary exposure was accepted. Every element, decoys, suppression, autonomous drones, manned aircraft, was introduced only when it contributed directly to the final effect. Nothing was there for symbolism. Nothing was there to impress. That discipline reflected a broader shift in Ukrainian operational culture. Early in the war, survival demanded improvisation. By 2026, effectiveness demanded selectivity. The question was no longer, can we hit this? But what does hitting this change and for how long? A destroyed vehicle mattered only if it disrupted a process. A blinded radar mattered only if it forced hesitation elsewhere. Tactical success was evaluated through strategic consequence. Russia, by contrast, continued to measure strength in terms of presence. More units, more coverage, more visible readiness. This approach reassured command structures and political audiences, but it also created predictable rhythms. Units rotated on known schedules. Convoys departed at similar times. Air defenses followed established doctrines that assumed threats would arrive in familiar forms. When those assumptions were violated, reaction lagged. The gap between assumption and reality widened slowly, then suddenly. In the weeks following the convoy's destruction, the affected sector did not collapse. There was no dramatic breakthrough. Instead, something subtler happened. Units began requesting resupply earlier than planned, then later than not at all. Artillery fires shortened. Vehicles were held back just in case. Commanders delayed movement until night, then delayed further because night no longer felt safe either. Momentum drained away without a single decisive engagement. This loss of momentum was not accidental. Ukrainian planners understood that logistics is not just about fuel and ammunition, it is about confidence. A supply line that arrives reliably allows commanders to plan boldly. One that arrives unpredictably encourages caution. And caution, in a war of maneuver and attrition, is a form of defeat that does not announce itself. As weeks turned into months, the lessons of that 40-minute window propagated outward. Russian planners began updating threat models. Areas previously considered rear zones were reclassified as contested. Escort requirements increased. Air defense assets were redistributed, leaving gaps elsewhere. Kinzhals and other high-end systems were assigned roles they were never intended to fill, not because they were optimal but because uncertainty demanded reassurance. This reallocation carried opportunity costs that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Every strategic missile used defensively was one not available for offense. Every air defense system tied to convoy protection was one not covering critical infrastructure. Every additional layer of security slowed movement further and consumed scarce trained personnel. Ukraine watched these adjustments closely. Information did not just flow from sensors and drones, it flowed from the enemy's reactions. When Russia reinforced one route, Ukraine inferred the value of what traveled along it. When escorts thickened in one sector and thinned in another, priorities revealed themselves. The battlefield became a conversation conducted through actions rather than words, and Ukraine learned to listen carefully. This is where correlation became decisive. A single data point meant little. A pattern meant everything. Ukraine's advantage lay not in possessing superior sensors individually, but in fusing inputs across domains, air, land, cyber, and human reporting, into a coherent picture that updated continuously. Decisions were made with the understanding that the picture would never be perfect, but it did not need to be. It needed only to be better than the opponents. And it was. Where Russia escalated to reassure itself, launching expensive systems, increasing visible readiness, signaling resolve, Ukraine escalated only when escalation no longer changed the outcome. By the time manned aircraft appeared on sensors, the convoy was already functionally doomed. By the time strategic systems were activated, the supply line was already severed. Escalation arrived late, impressive and largely irrelevant. This inversion of escalation logic had psychological effects that went far beyond the immediate battlefield. Russian commanders grew wary of being seen to react too strongly, knowing that reactions themselves could be exploited. Ukrainian commanders, conversely, became comfortable with restraint, trusting that patience and timing would yield greater returns than spectacle. Doubt crept in. It appeared first in planning sessions, where worst-case scenarios were given more weight than before. It appeared in orders that emphasized force protection over initiative. It appeared in after-action reports that struggled to explain how so much had gone wrong so quickly, with so little warning. Doubt is corrosive in war because it multiplies faster than fear. Fear can be addressed with force, with discipline, with reassurance. Doubt undermines the logic that justifies those responses. If the enemy can see you when you think you are hidden, strike you when you think you are protected, and disappear before you can respond, then every assumption becomes suspect. By late 2026, this doubt had reshaped how planners on both sides thought about visibility. Camouflage was no longer just visual. Emission control became as important as armor. Movement schedules were randomized. Static defense lost appeal. Mobility increased, but with it came new risks, as movement itself became a detectable signature. Ukraine adapted again. As Russian units reduced emissions, Ukrainian systems leaned harder on passive detection and inference. Silence itself became informative. When a unit that normally emitted went dark without explanation, it suggested preparation. When convoys halted unexpectedly, it suggested fear or deception. Every change in behavior became another input, another clue. This iterative cycle, action, reaction, adaptation, favored the side that could learn faster. Ukraine's advantage was not technological in isolation, it was organizational. Decision-making loops were shorter. Feedback traveled upward and sideways more freely. Failures were analyzed without being hidden. Successes were dissected for transferable lessons rather than celebrated as endpoints. In this environment, a 40-minute operation echoed for months. Not because of the wreckage left behind, but because of the questions it raised. What else could be seen that had been assumed invisible? What other supply lines were vulnerable in ways not yet understood? Which systems protected assets and which merely advertised their presence? These questions did not produce immediate answers. They produced hesitation. And hesitation, when faced with an opponent that had learned to weaponize time, became a liability. The most decisive strikes are often misunderstood because they do not align with traditional images of victory. There was no captured city, no encirclement broadcast on maps, no triumphant footage of columns advancing. Instead, there was absence, of fuel, of confidence, of momentum. There was delay. There was recalculation. There was a quiet shift in posture that only became obvious in hindsight. This is why asymmetric mastery is so difficult to counter. It does not announce itself. It does not rely on overwhelming force that can be matched or mirrored. It relies on understanding the system as a whole and identifying where minimal effort produces maximal disruption. It treats the enemy not as a collection of targets, but as a network of dependencies. In 40 minutes, a convoy was destroyed. In the weeks that followed, a sector lost momentum. Not suddenly, not catastrophically, but in a way that was far more dangerous because it unfolded quietly. There was no single order that announced the slowdown. No declaration that plans were suspended. Instead, the tempo thinned. Movements that had once been routine were postponed. Convoys that had departed on schedule now waited for additional escorts, additional confirmation, additional reassurance. Each delay seemed minor on its own. Together, they altered the rhythm of the front. Momentum in war is not only about speed, it is about confidence. It is the belief that actions taken today will still make sense tomorrow. When that belief weakens, initiative erodes. Commanders begin to hedge. They build contingencies on top of contingencies, until every decision carries so much caution that it ceases to move anything forward. That is what happened in the southern sector. The strike did not remove capability outright, it poisoned trust in the assumptions that capability depended on. Units closest to the front felt it first. Artillery batteries adjusted fire plans to conserve ammunition, unsure when the next resupply would arrive. Armored units limited maneuver, preferring to hold defensible ground rather than risk exposure on roads that had suddenly acquired reputations of their own. Engineers delayed construction tasks until routes could be swept again, even when those routes had been cleared days earlier. Each measure made sense in isolation. Collectively, they formed a pattern of restraint. That restraint was visible to the other side. Ukrainian observers did not need dramatic intelligence breakthroughs to notice the change. They saw it in the spacing of vehicles, in the timing of movements, in the way units lingered longer in covered areas before committing. They heard it in intercepted communications that asked more questions than before. They felt it in the absence of pressure where pressure had once been constant. The front had not frozen, but it had thickened, like oil cooling. Progress required more effort for less gain. Time, which Russia had once treated as something it could absorb through mass, became something it began to spend carefully. And time, spent cautiously, favors the side that has learned how to shape it. In the months after that, planners on both sides quietly updated their models of what was safe, what was visible, and what could no longer be taken for granted. These updates did not appear in public statements or press releases. They appeared in classified briefings, in revised checklists, in new questions added to planning templates. They appeared in what was no longer assumed. For Russian planners, the first realization was uncomfortable. Depth no longer guaranteed security. Rear areas, once treated as logistical sanctuaries, now required protection previously reserved for the front line. This forced a redistribution of assets that had cascading effects. Air defense systems pulled back to guard supply corridors left other areas thinner. Security battalions reassigned to convoy duty reduced manpower available for offensive tasks. Every layer added to protect logistics subtracted from something else. The second realization was more subtle and more damaging. Visibility had changed. It was no longer enough to ask whether something could be seen. The question became whether it could be inferred. Silence itself could betray intent. Patterns of movement, even when camouflaged, left statistical traces. Heat signatures lingered. Behavior repeated itself. The battlefield was no longer just a physical space, but a probabilistic one, where certainty was rare and confidence was fragile. For Ukrainian planners, the lessons ran in the opposite direction. The strike confirmed that precision did not need scale to achieve strategic effect. It reinforced the value of patience, of waiting for systems to expose themselves rather than forcing engagement prematurely. It validated an approach that treated enemy reactions as signals rather than obstacles. Every adjustment made by the opposing side was not just a defensive move, but new information. This mutual updating did not lead to symmetry. It widened the gap. Russia attempted to restore certainty by formalizing protection. New doctrines emphasized layered defense, redundancy, and visible readiness. Convoys moved with heavier escorts. Air defenses remained active longer. Commanders were encouraged to err on the side of overprotection. These measures reassured superiors and aligned with institutional habits, but they also increased emissions, slowed movement, and made patterns more pronounced. Ukraine responded not by mirroring these changes, but by refining its ability to read them. When escorts thickened, it suggested value. When emissions spiked, it suggested anxiety. When routes shifted repeatedly, it suggested uncertainty. Ukrainian planners began to think less in terms of targets and more in terms of behaviors. The battlefield became a living system, reacting to pressure in ways that could be anticipated and shaped. Long after the fires were extinguished and the wreckage cleared, something else remained, an unease that could not be repaired with more vehicles or stronger escorts. This unease did not manifest as panic. It manifested as friction. Decisions took longer. Approvals required more signatures. Risk assessments grew heavier. The invisible weight of doubt pressed down on every movement. Doubt is uniquely corrosive because it resists resolution. You cannot eliminate it with a show of force, because force itself may be what triggers exploitation. You cannot silence it with orders, because orders do not answer questions about what cannot be seen. Doubt thrives in gaps between perception and reality, and once it takes root, it alters behavior in ways that no single corrective action can reverse. On the southern front, this doubt reshaped daily routines. Drivers scanned the sky more often than the road. Radar operators hesitated before activating systems, aware that detection could invite destruction. Commanders weighed whether movement was more dangerous than staying still, and whether staying still was itself becoming a pattern that could be exploited. There were no right answers, only trade-offs that felt heavier than before. From the Ukrainian perspective, this was not chaos, it was leverage. The objective had never been to paralyze the enemy completely. It was to force the enemy to carry uncertainty into every decision. Once that happened, the battlefield tilted. The side burdened with doubt spent energy managing risk. The side that understood how that doubt was created spent energy choosing when to act. This dynamic revealed something fundamental about modern warfare. Destruction is no longer the sole or even primary measure of success. Influence over the enemy's decision-making process matters more. A destroyed convoy is temporary. A disrupted belief system lasts. Planners on both sides began to grapple with this reality, though not in equal ways. Russian institutions, built around hierarchical assurance and visible control, struggled to adapt to an environment where restraint could be more effective than assertion. Ukrainian institutions, forged under conditions of scarcity and adaptation, found that the same habits that had kept them alive now allowed them to shape outcomes beyond their immediate reach. This divergence was not about intelligence alone. It was about interpretation. Information without the ability to contextualize it becomes noise. Ukraine's advantage lay in its willingness to accept uncertainty as a condition rather than an anomaly. Plans were designed to function even when information was incomplete. Actions were chosen not because they guaranteed success, but because they constrained the enemy's options regardless of outcome. Over time, this approach created a cumulative effect. Each operation added a small layer of doubt. Each unexplained failure widened the gap between expectation and reality. Each forced escalation that produced no clear result weakened confidence in escalation itself. The enemy began to ask not just what happened, but what don't we understand yet? That question is the most dangerous one a force can ask itself in the middle of a war, because it has no immediate answer. The unease that lingered after the strike did not fade with repairs or reinforcements. Roads were cleared. Vehicles were replaced. Escorts were reorganized. On paper, the system recovered. But the memory of how quickly it had failed remained. That memory influenced choices in subtle ways: hesitation before movement, reluctance to commit reserves, preference for defensive postures even when offensive opportunities appeared. This is how doubt becomes persistent. It embeds itself not in hardware but in habits. It alters the default response from action to caution. It makes every plan provisional, every assumption suspect. And unlike physical damage, it cannot be bombed away or rebuilt with funds. Because sometimes the most decisive strikes are not the ones that annihilate forces or capture territory. They are the ones that reveal vulnerability where strength was assumed, visibility where concealment was trusted, and fragility where mass was believed to guarantee safety. Once that revelation occurs, the battlefield changes even if the map does not. And once doubt takes hold, it becomes the most persistent weapon of all. If this deep dive into Ukraine's ghost convoy annihilation, F-16 decoys, harm suppression, drone swarm execution, hit home, smash like, subscribe with bell, comment your location and thoughts on how such ops reshape Southern Front. Precision like this deserves spotlight. Lock in, this is Wartime Zone, next trap soon.